This book in the original Bangla is titled DOZAKHNAMA. The English version is also called DOZAKHNAMA with the subtitle Conversations in Hell. It's in the form of a dialogue between Manto and Ghalib. Manto and Ghalib are both dead, but they're talking to each other from their respective graves in India and in Pakistan and India across a historical gap of about 100 years and many thousands of kilometers in geography. Each of them talks about his own life and times, but curious parallels emerge between their lives and between the social and political milieus in which they lived. That's because Manto lived through the partition, as you know. He was born in India, he lived through the terrible days of the partition, and most of his memorable stories, or many of his memorable stories, were actually centered around the events of the partition. In Ghalib's case, he lived at a time when the Mughal Empire was on the decline and the British were taking over. So both lived through this period of astounding change where the world as they knew it was completely dismantled and a whole new world order took its place. In Manto's case, he may have had some hopes of the change being positive. Soon he was very disillusioned because they did not. In Ghalib's case, he knew all along that the end of the Mughal Empire and the advent of the British would not be something that he would be looking forward to, which is pretty much what happened. So in the course of talking about their respective lives, they covered a huge span of history, of social and cultural history, of the artists, the difficulties of the artist's life, the agony, the pain, the ways in which the artist must make a living in order to pursue his craft, and they make many observations on the human condition as well. So it's an incredible book really in terms of the audacity, first of all. I mean, to think of a concept of Ghalib and Manto talking to each other from their graves, it's quite an amazing structure. And then it's interwoven with many stories from their own lives, with Ghalib's poetry, with Manto's stories, and there are lots of imagined situations. For example, Ghalib is seen to have encounters with Kabir in Benares, which obviously did not happen in actual life. There are portions about the people he dreams of. There are stories that are drawn from Persian mythology, from history, from folklore, and it all adds up to quite a fantastic, an amazing journey. The writer's name is Ravi Shankar Bal. He has been writing for several years, but this probably again is his most interesting work. I first read about this book, in a column in Ananda Bajar Potrika, and the way it had been described interested me, so I went and picked up a copy. And then when I read the first 4 chapters, I was convinced that this book had to find a larger audience outside of Bengali reading people. I got into it almost as an extension of a personal pastime or hobby, you might call it. But we used to bring out a city magazine in Calcutta long ago called Calcutta Skyline, and we used to publish one short story in translation every issue. So that was how I really started doing it in a systematic way. And then one thing led to another. I started working on longer works, and then eventually, however, the first book, that's my translation of Chaurangi, was published much later in 2007. But once that book was published, I thought that it was a possibility to find a new passion in life, and I was just at that stage when I was probably at the right age for a midlife crisis. So either people when they reach that stage, they either do something very adventurous or stupid or silly, or they find something that will keep them meaningfully occupied. So in my case, translation prevented me from having that midlife crisis. Quite a few are out by now. 17 of them have been published so far. Chaurangi was the first, and then the second book that was published was Chaurangi by Shankar, which is a fairly iconic novel of Calcutta and has had readers down the generations in the Bengali language, and was translated into Hindi a long time ago, as a matter of fact. And after the English edition came out, it has consistently found readers. It's been 6-7 years almost now since it was published, and 7 years exactly, and I find new readers getting in touch with me every day. So it's one of those books which never seem to quite age. The second book was a novella by Buddhadev Basu. In the English version was called My Kind of Girl. The original is called Moner Moto Me. It's 4 individual tales held together within the framework of a railway station, where 4 passengers are stranded for the night because their train is delayed, and they decide to pass the night telling each other stories. And the stories that they tell are triggered by the very fleeting appearance of a young couple just married, very much clearly in love. And these men, who are all middle-aged, all look at one another, sharing an unspoken thought to the effect that, you know, they're so much in love now, they're so young, but they don't know that it will not last. And then each of them goes on to tell his or her own love story, which 3 out of the 4 stories are unrequited love. And one is a conventionally happy ending, but with twists. So that was the second book. The third book was Shankars again, Jono Aronno, translated as The Middleman in English. And there were quite a few others thereafter, but I think the ones that sort of stay with me for a long time, among them are Buddhadev Boshu's major novel Tithidor, which was translated as When the Time is Right, and Nabarun Bhattacharya's Harbat. I'm deliberately using Harbat as the name rather than the English version, which is quite an amazing piece of writing. And most recently, DOZAKHNAMA, which, as I just explained, is a very unusual book as well. Well, there seem to be 2 kinds of readers. One kind is are Bengali speaking or Bengali knowing people, but who don't read in Bangla anymore for various reasons. Partly, some people don't read in Bangla anymore because they no longer live in Bengal. Some of them don't live in the country. Others don't read because they've never, young people particularly, they never even started reading Bangla. So that's one kind of audience, and the other kind of audience are just people who like reading good books. So I'm sure that by virtue of going out to readers who cannot read the original language, the books and the authors would have found a wider readership in different geographies, and arguably for cultures for whom the books were not intended to begin with. So it is interesting to get some responses on how people from different geographies, different parts of India and the world read and relate to these books. Well, yes, of course, the partition and indeed a lot of political events afterwards. The Naxalite movement, for example, has spawned a lot of writing. Do they relate to it? Yes, I think they do, because for one thing, Indian cities are not all that different from each other. As you rightly point out, a novel that is set only in rural Bengal might have had more alien points of reference. But having said that, look at how popular Pather Panchali is. So it's not just a question of rural versus urban. Literature, Bangla fiction written up till about the 1980s does resonate quite well around India and elsewhere in the world. Since then, it's becoming a little tougher because many of the concerns now of contemporary writing in Calcutta seem a little out of date compared to people's concerns elsewhere in the country. Well, you know, it's almost a philosophical term, in the sense that sure, I don't know if the word lost is right, but sure, something changes in translation. You're not reading the original work anymore, but it is no translator's intent to rob the original of any of its qualities, good or bad. There are some factors that perhaps are untranslatable. I don't mean language and words and expressions, just that the way a Bengali speaking person living in Bengal will respond to a particular word or sentence will not be the same as the way a reader living elsewhere in India or elsewhere in the world does. But then that's true of any translation. When we read Marquez sitting here in India, I'm quite sure that we do not respond to the each and every nuance in there the way a person from Colombia would. So there are changes, but there's also a great deal that is gained perhaps because you read from a different perspective. But a good translation does not attempt to rob the original of anything, nor for that matter should it attempt to add anything to the original either. Leave out nothing and add nothing, that's the motto. Well, I just follow the text very closely. I'm led by the text. I have no theory of translation. I have no political perspectives to bring into a work. I do not wish to revise a work because I feel that some of it doesn't say things that I agree with. So I am led by the text, very closely by the text. I do not attempt to understand the writer or to read a critical literature about him or her and double guess anything about her. So it's like It's almost like singing, somebody hands you a tune and a set of words, and you follow the tune and you follow the words.